Good afternoon. I have spent the last 3 days in Ukraine speaking with individuals in the Jewish community for the purpose of assessing how this crisis in general, and in particular anti-Semitism, is impacting Jewish communities throughout this country. My office, of course, is charged with fighting anti-Semitism around the globe. But Ukraine is especially important given pro-Russian propaganda that we have seen increasingly throughout this crisis. Stories of increasing anti-Semitism, stories of how this interim government is populated by fascists and anti-Semites, and stories of Jews leaving in mass numbers from the country. Moreover, we continue to hear reports of pro-Russian actors purchasing and propagating propaganda around the globe targeting the worldwide Jewish community. Now, especially in light of these critical elections, elections which we are convinced this government is attempting to make fair and free, and especially in contrast to the mayhem we see in the East, where pro-Russian actors are creating havoc. We have found some overwhelming consensus among the Jewish community leaders and individuals we spoke to. First, there is no fear of anti-Semitism that is coming from this interim government. Secondly, overwhelming consensus that there are incidents of anti-Semitism, but they fall into two categories. Number one, anti-Semitism associated with pro-Russian actors in the East and South. An example, the New York Times report of the voting on the so-called referendum in Krasnoarmyak, where crude anti-Semitic posters were up in the voting areas. Two, incidents of anti-Semitism where the perpetrators are unknown, but where people in the Jewish community are overwhelmingly believe it is likely they were perpetrated by pro-Russian actors and believe that they were not associated with actors who are associated with the interim government, nor even with nationalist movements in Ukraine. So what is our reaction? First, it is wrong and dangerous to use anti-Semitism as a political tool in the run-up to this election, especially given the history of this part of the world. It is extremely dangerous. And two, pro-Russian and Russian government claims that anti-Semitism infects this interim government are simply false and misinformation. And three, that the government officials we did meet with were dedicated to try to get to the bottom of who perpetrated this and are dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism. So therefore, my office promises in the coming weeks leading up to this election and after to monitor any incidents of anti-Semitism and to call out the misinformation, especially as we run up to this critical election period. And finally, as we evaluate this propaganda, this misinformation, we have to ask if this is to be associated with the government, the interim government in Kyiv or nationalist elements, why is it happening in the East and South where pro-Russian elements are predominant? So that's my statement, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Okay, colleagues, while you're preparing the questions or thinking of the questions, if I may, the question from the moderator, Natalia Popovich, one of the co-founders of the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Just recently, we believe Radio Free Liberty or an international media resources was posting the statistics in terms of the rise of anti-Semitism in Ukraine, Russia, and other countries. And there was, I believe, if I'm quoting it rightly, that Ukraine was a bit higher up than Russia in this particular ranking. And it was attributed to an American sociological group that was doing this research. Are you aware of it, or do you have any statistics
No,
of that kind?
I'm afraid I'm not aware of these statistics. Let me say this. We certainly have seen incidents, but as I indicated, the perpetrators are often we believe they're provocations, and the strong consensus of the individuals I spoke to that they're provocations and not an indication of an uptick of inherent anti-Semitism. I have also seen data that within Russia, frankly, there's been an uptick in anti-Semitic sentiments, or incidences, I should say, not violent, but incidences in the first 4 months of 2014. And perhaps with some appeals to extreme Russian nationalism, this might be understandable.
Yeah, прошу.
Tell us, please, how functions your office in USA, and tell us whether there is such a possibility to create in the governments of other states some such offices like you on anti-Ukrainianism.
An anti-Ukrainian.
Yes, is it possibility? And how to organize it?
Well, my office in the United States was created by Congress 10 years ago, and its mandate is to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. We monitor, as you may have seen, by 2 reports every year, the Human Rights Report and the International Religious Freedom Report. And we monitor in roughly 60 countries incidents of anti-Semitism, as well, of course, as incidents of discrimination and intolerance against all types of minorities, all types of religions and ethnic groups. So within my government, there is certainly concern when any ethnicity, and certainly in Ukraine, are targeted for discrimination and violence. There are, in other countries around the world, human rights departments in foreign ministries and governments that are associated with this. I think, and particularly in this Ukraine crisis, this type of focus, and particularly in getting out correct information and countering misinformation, is critical.
What is your view in terms of the possible result for the European elections? Because there are reports of the fact that the makeup of the European Parliament will be very different from what it is right now. And there are countries in Europe where many more of the radical parties will be represented in the Parliament. And how will that have, what kind of effect will that have on the rights of the minorities in the European Union?
Well, there are many challenges along these lines. Certainly the economic downturn, the severe economic downturn in some countries comparable to the Great Depression, are fueling radicalism, fueling extremism. You only have to look at anti-Semitic parties, for example, openly anti-Semitic parties such as Jobbik in Hungary, Golden Dawn in Greece, who are gaining votes and also have street militia, a very dangerous trend. And of course, there is also great unhappiness at times, we all see, with sometimes with European institutions, given this crisis and given the changes in demographics in Europe. So I think this is happening, but I am confident also that the forces of tolerance in the European Union, forces of democracy, etc., will ultimately have huge majorities and will continue to dominate in the continent.
Great. Okay. Прошу, секунду.
Коневская Наталья, Коневская Ньюс. Я бы хотела сказать...
Just translate, it'll be okay.
Я бы хотела сказать, что нельзя, по-моему, рассматривать проблему антисемитизма только за короткий какой-то срок. Возможно, надо посмотреть, как население еврейское здесь живет многие годы, и десятилетия. И я бы хотела сказать, то есть, потому что практически все делегации, в которых есть со всего мира, приезжают в Украину, и там находятся евреи, очень часто у них близкие родственники на уровне дяди, тети, бабушки, дедушки, родные братья, сестры. Здесь километр находится Бабин Яр. Вот. И, по-моему, эта проблема постоянная. Я думаю, что, конечно, в открытую никто не будет из политиков выражать свои взгляды. Но я думаю, что международная общественность, и так как вы представляете такой серьезный международный мировой уровень, должны постоянно заниматься этой проблемой, потому что проблема антисемитизма в Украине присутствует. Ну, наверное, сейчас не стоит использовать детали, но это есть, этот вопрос постоянный, и этот вопрос постоянный для Украины. Поэтому очень приятно, что вы здесь присутствуете, и надеемся, что будут результаты от вашего визита в дальнейшем. Коневская News, но вы напишите
Natalia Konevskaya, Konevskaya News, so in a personal news resource. The comment is that when somebody is making an estimation of the level of anti-Semitism, it's impossible to look only at a short period of time. A lot of people who come as part of various delegations to monitor anti-Semitism, they have relatives who have been killed during Babin Yar, you know, not far from where we are, 1 kilometer from here. Ms. Konevskaya says that there are issues you know, pertaining in the history, and it's she's greeting your mission here, the fact that you are monitoring the situation and that you would you produce the results in terms of the report, because it's an issue that should be monitored at all times.
So I gather the question is how difficult in the short term particular it is to monitor. This is an excellent question, because it is, whether it's anti-Semitism or other forms of hate crimes, it is difficult to get good data. Of course, OSCE mandates that all its member states collect this data. But given lack of resources, often governments have been unable to do that. And governments combined with NGOs in some countries do quite a good job. But one of the tasks of my office is to attempt in the coming years to tighten that collection of data. Because if we're going to solve all forms of intolerance, we must have great and much better hate crime data to compare country to country and to get a good reading on the true levels of intolerance and, in this case, anti-Semitism. For example, we see sometimes in countries an uptick in anti-Semitism, and it may not reflect a true increase. It may just reflect that the reporting is better. So we have to get beyond that, and that is an important and critical tool. And we hope, again, with working with governments, working with this government, this interim government, and the next government that will be elected in free and fair elections, that we will have opportunities to increase in working with NGOs often, increase that data and the quality of that data.
If possible, that would be the last question, right? Mm-hmm.
And what a real impact has all this data collected by NGOs?
Well, it allows NGOs as well as government actors like my office to assess where the problems really are. And to, it's very easy, as you know, to get excited by one newspaper headline or sometimes by misinformation. So having hard data allows NGOs as well as governments to use the very scarce resources to truly target the serious problems and avoid issues that are not really indicative of a real problem.
If I may just follow up on this question, how do you deal with countries where the civil society is weak, or where international civil organizations or civic organizations have been forbidden to an extent, like in the Russian Federation, for example? How do you rely, on what data do you rely in terms of tracking cases of not only anti-Semitism, but again, you know, hate
Other
acts
forms,
and
yes.
other forms of prejudice towards minorities? Because the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine has in numerous occasions pointed out to the Russian Federation that there are, you know, over 2 million Ukrainians living in Russian Federation whose rights are not necessarily cherished there.
Again, an excellent question, and the bureau within the State Department where I work, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, is very much is focused on building up civil society. And that's a long-term and often difficult process, but we do everything we can to encourage the growth, even in semi-authoritarian nations, the growth of civil society. And unfortunately, in some nations, we've seen a deterioration of the positions of civil society. But the U.S. is dedicated to building up civil society as a backbone and an anchor of democratic and free and fair societies.
Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, this was the final for today. Thank you very much. And we actually will have one more briefing tomorrow from the delegation of the U.S. Congress House of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Affairs Committee. So look forward to seeing you all tomorrow at 4:15. Thank you.